And it's in such sharp contrast to some other ceremonies here, particularly of President Kennedy. This is a day when you can, when for all the mourning that we talk about, you can actually say, all right, you know, Ronald Reagan had his full run.
And there is the casket. It's about to go off the caisson. To the left of your screen, you see a riderless horse once again. To our viewers who may just be tuning in, that symbolizes the Commander-in-Chief. No longer there. The boots strapped backwards into the stirrups of that riderless horse. This is the scene from atop the west side of the U.S. Capitol. The casket about to be removed from the caisson. It's made its way up Constitution Avenue to Capitol Hill, and it will now shortly be carried by hand by the honor guard up these stairs and then placed inside the Capitol Rotunda.
And it hasn't been confirmed yet whether the Reagan children will follow the casket into the Rotunda. We are told that Nancy Reagan will be entering from a side door around the back side of the Capitol. We'll be watching for that.
Nancy Reagan is already there. Her limousine has arrived. She's making her way, though, to the from the east side to the west side. She'll be there to receive the casket, and so many other dignitaries. The diplomatic corps, by the way, is already in place. Representatives of about 170 countries have been invited to participate. Those would be the countries that have formal diplomatic relations, for Professor Dallek, with the United States. The ambassadors or chargés are here now, but on Friday, heads of state, heads of government from all over the world will arrive in Washington for the National Cathedral ceremony, the funeral service. This may turn out to be the largest gathering of world leaders in Washington, D.C. ever.
Can I point out something before we start? Because about the only thing we need to listen to before you start with the answer. The casket will not come off the caisson until we hear the 21-gun salute. And then we'll hear a military band play.
Well, you know, what I'm struck by is the fact that we were offshoots of Great Britain. And though it's well over 200 years, in a sense, what one can talk about is the ceremonial that the British are so adept at. A personal memory, if I may, I taught at Oxford one year. I had to give an inaugural address. The amount of detail that I was instructed in as to how I would wear my academic garb, how I would be escorted by a vice chancellor with a medieval mace, would come to the top of the staircase where I was going to go down to lecture, and how they'd bang the mace 3 times on the floor. I'd get down there to give my lecture. Nobody introduced me. You see, the English tradition is, well, you're so well known, you don't need an introduction, I guess. But I think of the English, because this is where I think, in part, Paula, your point about you marvel at the detail, but I think it is a kind of English tradition that we in a sense, hark to.
All right, let's listen in as this service begins.
inside the rotunda now, where you can see that members of the Reagan family have already arrived. It wasn't clear whether Patty Davis and her brother Ron Reagan would follow the casket into the rotunda. They obviously arrived with Nancy Reagan.
And in the front of the screen, our viewers are seeing the Speaker of the House, Dennis Hastert. They're all gathered inside, awaiting the casket to be carried up those stairs of the west side of the U.S. Capitol. Ron Reagan, Patty Davis. Mrs. Reagan will be inside shortly. Once she is, we're told, there will be the 21-gun salute, which will result eventually in the casket being removed from the caisson and carried up those stairs. The 21-gun salute, an honor for a president of the United States who has passed away. It goes back, by the way, Paula, to the 17th century when cannons would be fired by a defeated enemy to show they had expended their ammunition. Let's listen in again as we await this 21-gun salute. As we await this casket to arrive here in the rotunda.
There's a friend. She suffered a stroke a while ago, and one of the wishes of the president was for her to eulogize him. And what we will see unfold on Friday is a pre-taped, pre-recorded eulogy to the president. Jeff, this was a friendship that a lot of people never thought would develop the way it did.
It was quite remarkable because she was to Great Britain what Reagan was to the United States, in that she posed rhetorically a full-scale frontal challenge to the dominant political culture, which was liberal left in Great Britain. And she won the Conservative Party nomination away from a more centrist figure, just the way Ronald Reagan took the nomination. And they partnered up, along with Pope John Paul II. They are often considered the triumvirate that really put the Soviet Empire on the defensive by asserting strongly the moral superiority of the West.
That was Brian Mulroney, the former Canadian Prime Minister. Among so many of the dignitaries, world leaders who have come, Brian Mulroney had worked together with President Reagan during the Reagan administration. Others now beginning to emerge. What was interesting also is when Margaret Thatcher went up to the casket, she was escorted by Senator Bill Frist, the Senate Majority Leader, brought her up there. She has come to pay her respects, and now so many others are beginning this long process to do exactly the same thing. And look at this, Paula, you mentioned earlier Dan Quayle coming up, and Mrs. Quayle, there they are.
We have not seen much of the former vice president in public lately. He had moved back to Arizona to teach for a while.
What's interesting, I think,
Marilyn
also,
Quayle, still
yes,
practicing law.
Yeah. But what's interesting, the points you've been making about Reagan in his second term becoming a foreign policy president. There was so much feeling at the start of his term that he would be a domestic leader but not a foreign policy leader. And events.
And speaking about foreign policy, President George P. Shultz, his Secretary of State, has come back to Washington to pay his respects, and Mrs. Shultz as well, the former Secretary of State, saluting his Commander-in-Chief, lying in state now. And here's another former Secretary of State, Alexander Haig, who is coming by with Mrs. Haig as well. We're going to see a lot of these leaders, people who were close to Ronald Reagan, Paula, begin to come by, spend a few seconds there, and move on. It's only the beginning of this process.
And Al Haig has been fiercely protective of the president's legacy. In an interview he did a couple days ago that I watched on TV, when someone challenged what they thought was the overwrought analysis of what he gave to the country, Al Haig said, look, this is not the time to be debating that.
This is Peggy Noonan, who was a speechwriter for Ronald Reagan, wrote some of the more memorable speeches, Jeff, that we all remember.
She wrote the Ponk de Hoc speech commemorating the 40th anniversary of D-Day. She wrote the Challenger speech and wrote a book called When Character Was King, celebrating Ronald Reagan's life. That, I believe, is Ken Duberstein.
Ken Duberstein and his wife. Ken Duberstein was the chief of staff during the final year of the Reagan administration. He has remained very, very close to Mrs. Reagan, and he has come, of course, to pay his respects as well. And we're going to see this continuing stream of people who were close to the Reagans.
They will need at least a half hour once all of these mourners leave this part of the service to enable the public to also pay their respects.
There's Ed Meese, the former Attorney General of the United States, who worked with Ronald Reagan closely in California for so many years before coming to Washington. Ed Meese has stayed here in Washington since President Reagan moved back to California. We're going to see a lot of memories of people coming by to remember and to reflect. This is the two daughters of the Vice President, Dick Cheney, who have come by to also pay their respects. We had seen Lynn Cheney, their mother, with the Vice President, and now we see the two daughters of Lynn and Dick Cheney paying their respects.
Well, Wolf, you were saying before that there may be more foreign dignitaries at this funeral than of any other president in the country's history. And it is ironic because, as I was saying before, Reagan was thought to be a domestic president, not terribly interested in foreign affairs, but his whole second term was really dominated by foreign policy and by a shift, a dramatic shift, because at the start of his first term he speaks of the evil empire. He leaves that rhetoric behind and seizes upon the opportunity that Jeff was mentioning to negotiate with Gorbachev and to, in a sense, repair America's world image, because you have to recall we came out of the 70s in a sense a defeated nation. The frustrations over Vietnam, the loss in that war, and in that sense, Reagan recreates a kind of upbeat mood about American foreign policy.
And Reagan always said that his critics misunderstood him, that he was looking to build the defenses so that the Soviet Union, once they realized they couldn't compete, would move toward disarmament. Reagan, in fact, opposed the nuclear freeze because he said he wanted to eliminate nuclear weapons, and at Reykjavik, he and Gorbachev came so close to that Reagan's own staff was panicked.
And of course they did. He and Gorbachev eliminated a whole category of nuclear weapons, the intermediate nuclear missiles.
I have to say one quick story. When Reagan used the phrase evil empire, and there was a great hullabaloo, a fellow I know who was no conservative turned to his fellow liberals and said, what part of that sentence, what part of that phrase do you disagree with?
The evil or the empire?
Do you think it wasn't an empire? Do you think it was an evil? I mean, that was a case in which people who saw Reagan as a bellicose figure, you know, after several years, people look back on it and said, maybe this guy wasn't quite who we thought he was. The other great story is he always said, if I could get a Soviet leader, I'd take him in a helicopter and fly him over a typical middle-income neighborhood. And if he saw the swimming pools and the backyards and realized how well we live, he'd want to change the Soviet Union. And I actually think he did that with Gorbachev.
One of the things that struck me, though, this evening in hearing Mr. Hastert speak and Senator Stevens and then the Vice President was they hit the obvious themes about his sense of eternal optimism, but there wasn't anything too personal in the remarks. Do you expect that to come on Friday? Because the one thing you hear over and over again from people who worked in the White House with Ronald Reagan, what a kind man he was, what a decent man. And Jeff, you were talking about how he was one of the few presidents who found that grace note, no matter how uncomfortable a situation was.
When he first got into politics and ran for governor, his rhetoric was very tough on student protesters at Berkeley, on people who were rioting. It was a very steely rhetoric. I think he had an instinctive sense that in running for president, you had to speak differently. And I remember a story, I mean, as I told you many years ago, I worked for Robert Kennedy. One of the first things he did when he became president was he gave Robert Kennedy, posthumously obviously, the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Because, you know, it was a little grace note. Clearly, there was no political symmetry.
What it spoke volumes about was his pragmatism. You know, Herbert Hoover said of Franklin Roosevelt, he was a chameleon on plaid. And Roosevelt wore that badge proudly. Reagan was the same way. There were so many shifts and changes in the way he went about doing business, not just in domestic politics, but particularly in foreign affairs. And this is what I think allowed him to succeed.
And we're now looking at members of the Senate and the House of Representatives, their spouses, some of their children, also beginning to move through this rotunda to pay their respects to this President of the United States. Judy Woodruff is up on Capitol Hill. So many faces from another decade, Judy, that are beginning to emerge in Washington have returned to join in the tributes to Ronald Reagan.
Wolf, they have. In fact, one of the faces that we have not seen in a very long time is one of the daughters of former President Richard Nixon. Tricia Nixon walked by with her husband, Ed Cox. One of the first couples to walk up to touch the casket, the flag over the casket of President Reagan. This is quite an extraordinary collection of Americans we are watching. They all have different connections with Ronald Reagan. Some of them worked for him. Some, no doubt, came into politics because of him. I saw Bill Frist's wife, Karen, and their older son walk up alone a few minutes after Senator Frist had escorted former Prime Minister Thatcher away from or out of the rotunda. But all of these people have been waiting. We were told there were over 800 people there, and they are now waiting their turn to come and touch the flag or simply pause and pay their respects before the American people can walk by. It is an extraordinary collection.
Thanks so much, Judy. Let's go back to Frank Sesno now to hear more of his thoughts about how this all played out this evening. What else struck you tonight, Frank?
Well, Paula, the House chaplain said at one point in his prayer, Ronald Wilson Reagan played many roles, so many of them, and he made it seem easy. And, you know, that's an interesting and very accurate observation. I'm watched and attended probably hundreds, I don't know, maybe thousands of his speeches. And for the most part, I have to say, not only did he make it seem easy, he had a great time. This was a job and a role he loved. There were a few notable, very low moments in his presidency. The Beirut barracks bombing, which his aides say was his most lasting sort of policy regret and sadness. Of course, the Iran-Contra affair, and when Mrs. Reagan fell victim to breast cancer. That one was very hard for him. But for the most part, this was an office that he simply relished and loved. And another point, Dick Cheney talked about the length of this man's life. Born in 1911, he literally spanned and shaped a century. And as we see some of these elected representatives go through, just keep this in mind. When Ronald Reagan was running for president in 1980, the Democrats held a majority in the Congress, the governorships around the country, and in state legislatures. Now, the Republicans are dominant in all of those areas, some very closely, but nonetheless dominant.
And we're seeing now, Frank, a changing of the guard around the casket right in the middle of the rotunda on Capitol Hill. This will be happening, we're told, every 30 minutes a new team will come in. They will be guarding this casket until this casket eventually leaves here for the Washington National Cathedral. That would be Friday morning for the full funeral service, the state funeral that is already, of course, being intimately and closely planned out every step of the way. Let's watch this changing of the guard, because this will happen every 30 minutes as these crowds continue to go by. And as we watch it, I want Professor Robert Dallek, the eminent presidential historian, to reflect on the detail for dignity.
Yeah, there's so much concern with assuring that the nation sees this ceremonial as something they can remember, something that is burned into their memories as a landmark historical event. And I think that's what's being carried off here today, and will be carried off again Friday in the service at the National Cathedral. It's also interesting that the service at the National Cathedral, the other president, who of course, in a sense, will be there, deceased president, is Woodrow Wilson, because he's buried at that National Cathedral. And here Reagan's middle name is Wilson, and not that he was named after that Woodrow Wilson, because Reagan was born in 1911 and Wilson didn't become president until 1913.
But the restoration, the phrases that Vice President Cheney was using, I think, is a key part to the people who argue for Reagan's greatness. I mean, we all know the history, but you come through the assassination of President Kennedy, the Vietnam War escalates in the 60s, race begins to fall apart in this country, the generations split, Nixon comes in promising to restore a certain sense of order, and we wind up with Watergate, and Carter comes in promising to restore a sense of a government as good as the American people, and we wind up with inflation and recession and hostages. And Reagan comes in, and you can argue whether it was luck or skill or the celestial movement of the stars, but the 80s were, by contrast, a better time for this country, and it's, I believe, one big reason why he is looked upon with such fondness.
And we're showing our viewers both what's happening inside the rotunda as the casket now lies in state, and what's happening outside as the lines have formed. Thousands of people already getting ready to spend the next several hours trying to get through these lines and go and pay their respects. Our Anderson Cooper is outside the Capitol, outside the rotunda. He's with the people out there. Anderson, what's happening?
Wolf, as you said, thousands of people have lined up. The line has really grown in the last hour or so since the procession finished. It seemed like a lot of people who were there watching the caisson, the casket go by, they have now come to join the line. It is very somber, it is very peaceful, very respectful here. What is fascinating is how many young people there are on the line. People really of all ages, but an awful lot of young people. I want to introduce you to a couple. This is Brian Wayert. He's 32 years old. You flew all the way from Illinois just to be here this morning. Why?
To say goodbye. He was my president. And, you know, I started watching when I was 8 years old when he won the election in '80. And from then on, he's been my president, he's been my leader.
It's fascinating because when he got into office, he was the oldest president to serve, 69 when he was first elected. You were 8 years old. What was it at 8 years old that so captured your interest, your affection?
He made me feel good to be an American. The way his optimism kind of rang through in everything he did, and the way he was able to he truly was the great communicator, and he spoke to me, and he made me proud to be an American.
And as you go by the casket tonight, what's going to go through your mind?
I've been thinking about that all day. I thought about it as I watched the casket roll by this afternoon. I don't really know. I've been to the Presidential Library. I'm from Rock Island, Illinois. I've been to the boyhood home. This is going to be my goodbye.
We're taking you live to the rotunda of the United States Capitol, where a very familiar face, the man who led the Soviet Union during Ronald Reagan's presidency, Mikhail Gorbachev, is standing there to pay his respects to the man he faced off in the Cold War. It was Mikhail Gorbachev who brought reform to the Soviet Union, who led to the collapse of communism and to the Soviet Union. Today, Mikhail Gorbachev stands 16 years later representing Russia. Mikhail Gorbachev, whose place in history forever tied to Ronald Reagan. Well, outside the United States Capitol, CNN's Sean Caleb's is standing by. He's been talking to some of the thousands of people waiting in line to get in. Sean, what is it like?
Well, Judy, it's actually kind of amazing to watch this. The line simply gets longer and longer. Now as the workday here in Washington, D.C. comes to an end, a lot of people are
all kinds of dignitaries coming through. Just a short while ago, we had the new Iraqi president, a historic moment. Ghazi al-Zarwa came through into the Capitol. He has actually not gone past the casket yet. We're expecting maybe within about 10 minutes he may come by with Senate Majority Leader Bill Frist. He's been meeting over in Frist's office. Also, Sandra Day O'Connor, the first Sandra Day O'Connor, the first female Supreme Court justice ever appointed by Reagan. She comes in. What a moment to come in and pay her respects to Mr. Reagan. She was in earlier today. Bob Dole also in earlier, the former Senate Majority Leader and presidential candidate. Later today, we're expecting Prince Charles, also Mikhail Gorbachev, former President Bush. So many different dignitaries coming through, in addition to people from all around the country, and a very emotional moment earlier today showing that people of all walks of life, from all walks of life, are coming through, paying their tribute.
Where there are members of the House and the Senate, the leadership of Washington awaiting the arrival and this ceremony about to begin. I want to bring in our senior White House correspondent, John King. The Vice President is here. He will speak. John, the President is at the G8 summit where you are in Sea Island, Georgia. It was a difficult decision, I assume, for him to decide not to come back to Washington in advance in order to participate in this event.
It was a difficult decision, White House officials tell us, Wolf, but they also say that the senior White House staff was in touch with the Reagan family and that Nancy Reagan relayed word that she fully understood that it was important for the president to stay at this critical international summit. Mr. Bush, though, as soon as he gets back to Washington tomorrow night, he and the First Lady will go to the rotunda tomorrow night. They will visit the casket there. They also will participate in memorial reflections there, and they, after leaving the Capitol tomorrow night, Wolf, when they get back to Washington, they will go to Blair House, where Nancy Reagan is staying right across the street from the White House while she is in town, and we are told the President and the First Lady will spend some private time with Nancy Reagan. We also know from the President's staff today that he, even while here at this summit, has been working on the eulogy he will deliver Friday at the National Cathedral. Aides tell us to look for it to run about 10 to 12 minutes. Not so much this President's personal reflections on Ronald Reagan. Aides say this President Bush wants to deliver a eulogy on what he believes Ronald Reagan meant to the country. Wolf?
All right, John King explaining why the President is not here. The Vice President will be speaking together with the Speaker of the House, Dennis Hastert, the Senate President Pro Tem of the Senate, Senator Ted Stevens, the ranking Republican member, the Majority Leader in the Majority Member of the U.S. Senate, not the Majority Leader, but the Senator with the longest continuing service in the U.S. Senate. We're looking at these live pictures of representatives of the Senate and the House who have come to pay tribute to this President of the United States. Paula, that casket will be coming in. Go ahead.
I just saw a face I had not seen in a while, that of Dan Quayle, standing next to Trent Lott.
And here it comes, the color guard, the honor guard, moving in. This next phase of this service, this funeral, this memorial service to the 40th President of the United States is about to begin, so let's listen once again.
Let us pray. The poet T.S. Eliot wrote, "Neither does the actor suffer, nor the patient act, but both are fixed in an eternal patience, an eternal act. And the wheel turns. The wheel turns and is forever still. Ronald Wilson Reagan had many roles to play in life: husband, father, governor. But the most notable role on the world stage was that of the 40th President of the United States of America. With his style and grace, he made it seem easy. With his compassion and sense of timing, he brought strength of character to the nation and enkindled hope in a darkened world. As the patient, he brought humility to greatness and presided over embracing life to its natural end and dying with dignity, surrounded by love. To you, O Lord, ever patient with all of us, ever active in all of us, be praise and thanks for the life and impact Ronald Reagan has had upon us all. Support with your grace the Reagan family, and especially Mrs. Nancy Reagan, who stood by him in memorable moments of history and never left him in the long moments of difficult performance when the wheel turned all so slowly. Inspired by President Reagan, empower all of us, Lord, to employ our part in crumbling the walls of separation and in opening the gates to a globalized world. May our stillness here help us to remain faithful and patient with those suffering and to make decisions that will renew faith in the future. All-powerful God, fix America in your eternal patience, in your eternal act, as the wheel turns, now and forever. Amen.
Mrs. Reagan, Patty, Ron, Michael, distinguished guests, members of the Reagan family, and friends of Ronald Reagan in America and throughout the world. Tonight, President Ronald Reagan has returned to the People's House to be honored by millions of Americans who loved him. Since 1824, under this rotunda, our nation has paid final tribute to many dedicated public servants. President Abraham Lincoln was the first president to lie in state under this Capitol dome. In the coming days, thousands will come to these hallowed halls to say goodbye to another son of Illinois who, like Lincoln, appealed to our best hopes, not our worst fears. In the life of any nation, few men forever alter the course of history. Ronald Reagan was one of those men. He rose from a young boy who didn't have much to a man who had it all, including the love of a faithful partner and friend he found in his wife, Nancy. The true measure of any man is what he does with the opportunities life offers. By that standard, Ronald Reagan was one of America's greatest. He first proved that as governor of California and later as President of the United States. When Ronald Reagan was sworn in as our 40th president, this nation was gripped by a powerful malaise. Inflation and unemployment were soaring, and the Soviet Union was winning the Cold War. By the time President Reagan left office, he had reversed the trend of ever-increasing government control over our lives, restored our defense capabilities, guided us through the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression, and set in motion policies which ultimately led to the collapse of the evil empire. His integrity, vision, and commitment were respected by all. But history's final judgment, I believe, will remember most his ability to inspire us. President Reagan put it best when he said, "The greatest leader is not necessarily the one who does the greatest things. He is the one that gets the people to do the greatest things." This president inspired Americans by reaching out far beyond what he could attain. Like a good coach, he understood the value of a goal isn't always in achieving it. Sometimes it's enough to simply look out into the future and remind people what is possible. And often, President Reagan achieved the impossible. He reminded us that government is not the solution. The solution lies in each of us. True American heroes are ordinary people who live their lives with extraordinary character and strength. President Reagan showed us freedom was not just a slogan. He actually brought freedom to hundreds of thousands of people around this globe by opposing oppressive regimes. Those of us from the World War II generation looked up to him for his moral courage. In him, we saw leadership of great men like Eisenhower, who led the way and moved us to follow. On a wintry day in 1981, Ronald Reagan stood on the steps that lie just behind these doors to deliver his first inaugural address. He spoke of a journal written by a young American who went to France in 1917 and died for the cause of freedom. From that journal, he read these words: "I will work, I will save, I will sacrifice, I will endure, I will fight cheerfully, and I will do my utmost as if the issue of the whole struggle depended upon me alone." Throughout his life, Ronald Reagan bore our burdens as if the income did depend on him alone. We will all remember him as an unparalleled leader and an exceptional man who lifted our nation and set the world on a new path. President Reagan achieved greatness in his life. Some might even argue he transcended it. He could not have accomplished this without Nancy. Nancy is one of the finest first ladies these United States have ever known. And the love Ronald and Nancy Reagan shared touched the hearts of people everywhere. In 1989, President Reagan delivered his farewell address from the Oval Office. In that speech, the President spoke of the shining city on a hill that, after 200 years, 2 centuries, still stands strong and true on the granite ridge. Now it is our turn to thank Ronald Reagan for making us believe in that shining city. And as we say farewell, his last words as president echo across this nation. If we listen, we will hear him whisper the humble words he used to sum up his revolution. All in all, not bad at all.
Mrs. Reagan, Mr. Vice President, members of Congress, and distinguished guests, Ronald Reagan's long journey has finally drawn to a close. It is altogether fitting and proper that he has returned to this Capitol Rotunda, like another great son of Illinois, Abraham Lincoln, so the nation can say goodbye. This Capitol building is, for many, the greatest symbol of democracy and freedom in the world. It brings to mind the shining city on a hill, which President Reagan so often spoke. It is the right place to honor a man who so faithfully defended our freedom and so successfully helped extend the blessings of liberty to millions of people around the world. Mrs. Reagan, thank you for sharing your husband with us, for your steadfast love and for your great faith. We pray for you and for your family in this time of great mourning. But as we mourn, we must also celebrate the life and the vision of one of America's greatest presidents. His story and values are quintessentially American. Born in Tampico, Illinois, and then raised in Dixon, Illinois, he moved west to follow his dreams. He brought with him a Midwest optimism, and he blended it with a Western can-do spirit. In 1980, the year of the Reagan Revolution, his vision of hope, of growth, of opportunity was exactly what the American people needed and wanted. His message touched a fundamental core that is deeply embedded in the American experience. President Reagan dared to dream that America had a special mission. He believed in the essential goodness of the American people and that we had a special duty to promote peace and freedom for the rest of the world. Against the advice of the timid, he sent a chilling message to authoritarian governments everywhere that the civilized world would not rest until freedom reigned in every corner of the globe. While others worried, President Reagan persevered. When others weakened, President Reagan stood tall. When others stepped back, President Reagan stepped forward. And he did it all with great humility, with great charm, and with great humor. Tonight, we will open these doors and let the men and women who Ronald Reagan served so faithfully file past and say goodbye to a man who meant so much to so many. It is their being here that I think would mean more to him than any words that we may say. Because it was from America's great and good people that Ronald Reagan drew his strength. In the years ahead, we will tell our grandchildren about this night when we gathered here to honor the man from Illinois who became the son of California and then the son of all America. And then our grandchildren will tell their grandchildren, and President Reagan's spirit and eternal faith in America will carry on. Ronald Reagan helped make our country and this world a better place to live. But he always believed that our best days were ahead of us, not behind us. I can still hear him say, with that twinkle in his eye, "You ain't seen nothing yet." President Reagan once said, "We make a living by what we get. We make a life by what we give." 20 years ago, President Reagan stood on the beaches of Normandy to honor those who made a life by what they gave. Recalling the men who scaled the cliffs and crossed the beaches in a merciless hail of bullets, he asked, who were these men? These ordinary men doing extraordinary things. His answer was simple and direct. They were Americans. So I can think of no higher tribute or honor or title to confer upon Ronald Reagan than just to simply say he was an American. Godspeed, Mr. President. God bless you, and God bless the United States of America.
Mrs. Reagan, members of the President's family, colleagues, distinguished guests, members of the Diplomatic Corps, fellow citizens. Knowing that this moment would come has not made it any easier to see the honor guard and the flag draped before us and to begin America's farewell to President Ronald Reagan. He said goodbye to us in a letter that showed his great courage and love for America. Yet for his friends and for his country, the parting comes only now. And in this national vigil of mourning, we show how much America loved this good man and how greatly we will miss him. A harsh winter morning in 1985 brought the inaugural ceremony inside to this rotunda. And standing in this place for the 50th presidential inauguration, Ronald Reagan spoke of a nation that was hopeful, big-hearted, idealistic, daring, decent, and fair. That was how he saw America, and that is how America came to know him. There was a kindness, simplicity, and goodness of character that marked all the years of his life. When you mourn a man of 93, no one is left who remembers him as a child in his mother's arms. Ronald Wilson Reagan's life began in a time and place so different from our own, in a quiet town on the prairie on the 6th of February, 1911. Nell and Jack Reagan would live long enough to see the kind of man they had raised, but they could never know all that destiny had in store for the boy they called Dutch. And if they could witness this scene in 2004, their son taken to his rest with the full honors of the United States, they would be so proud of all he had done with the life they gave him and the things they taught him. President Reagan once said, "I learned from my father the value of hard work and ambition and maybe a little something about telling a story." That was the Ronald Reagan who confidently set out on his own from Dixon, Illinois during the Great Depression, the man who would one day speak before cameras and crowds with such ease and self-command. From my mother, said President Reagan, I learned the value of prayer. My mother told me that everything in life happened for a purpose. She said all things were part of God's plan, even the most disheartening setbacks, and in the end, everything worked out for the best. This was the Ronald Reagan who had faith not just in his own gifts and his own future, but in the possibilities of every life. The cheerful spirit that carried him forward was more than a disposition. It was the optimism of a faithful soul who trusted in God's purposes and knew those purposes to be right and true. He once said, "There's no question I am an idealist," which is another way of saying, I am an American. We usually associate that quality with youth, and yet one of the most idealistic men ever to become president was also the oldest. He excelled in professions that have left many others jaded and self-satisfied, and yet somehow remained untouched by the worst influences of fame or power. If Ronald Reagan ever uttered a cynical or cruel or selfish word, the moment went unrecorded. Those who knew him in his youth and those who knew him a lifetime later all remember his largeness of spirit, his gentle instincts, and a quiet rectitude that drew others to him. Seen now at a distance, his strengths as a man and as a leader are only more impressive. It's the nature of the city of Washington that men and women arrive, leave their mark, and go their way. Some figures who seemed quite large and important in their day are sometimes forgotten or remembered with ambivalence. Yet nearly a generation after the often impassioned debates of the Reagan years, what lingers from that time is almost all good. And this is because of the calm and kind man who stood at the center of events. We think back with appreciation for the decency of our 40th president and respect for all that he achieved. After so much turmoil in the 60s and 70s, our nation had begun to lose confidence, and some were heard to say that the presidency might even be too big for one man. That phrase did not survive the 1980s. For decades, America had waged a Cold War, and few believed it could possibly end in our own lifetimes. The president was one of those few, and it was the vision and the will of Ronald Reagan that gave hope to the oppressed, shamed the oppressors, and ended an evil empire. More than any other influence, the Cold War was ended by the perseverance and courage of one man who answered falsehood with truth and overcame evil with good. Ronald Reagan was more than an historic figure. He was a providential man who came along just when our nation and the world most needed him. And believing as he did that there is a plan at work in each life, he accepted not only the great duties that came to him, but also the great trials that came near the end. When he learned of his illness, his first thoughts were of Nancy. And who else but Ronald Reagan could face his own decline and death with a final message of hope to his country, telling us that for America, there is always a bright dawn ahead. Fellow Americans, here lies a graceful and a gallant man. Nancy, none of us can take away the sadness you are feeling. I hope it is a comfort to know how much he means to us and how much you mean to us as well. We honor your grace, your own courage, and above all, the great love that you gave to your husband. When these days of ceremony are completed, the nation returns him to you for the final journey to the West. And when he is laid to rest under the Pacific sky, we will be thinking of you as we commend to the Almighty the soul of his faithful servant, Ronald Wilson Reagan.
us bow for the benediction. O giver of every good and perfect gift, accept our gratitude for the life of your servant, President Ronald Reagan, whose love for freedom summoned our nation to embrace our best hopes and not our worst fears. Thank you for his ability to plant seeds of confidence and not doubt, and to lift liberty's lamp until totalitarian towers tumbled. In the days to come, remind us of America's opportunity to remain a shining city on a hill. Continue to comfort those who mourn. In a special way, be near to Mrs. Nancy Reagan and the family. May the death of this beloved leader prompt us to see you more clearly, to love you more dearly, and to follow you more nearly day by day. Now fill us with your peace as we trust you, so that we may overflow with hope by the power of your Spirit. Amen.
rotunda in the U.S. Capitol. Now, the casket of Ronald Wilson Reagan lying in state. It will lie here tonight and tomorrow. Tens of thousands of people will come by to pay their respects to the 40th President of the United States. Paula, we saw his wife, Nancy Reagan, walk up to that casket and touch that American flag. Clearly, it was a very, very difficult moment for her.
She ran her hand almost along the full length of the casket several times. Then it appeared as though she was looking back at the Vice President, as though she could almost not take it anymore. And then shortly after that, Michael Reagan, a young man adopted by President Reagan during his marriage to Jane Wyman, came up to the casket, kissed the casket, and said a short prayer.
And he gave us a little salute as well to his father, the late President of the United States. Jeff Greenfield, this has been a very emotional moment.
It has been an emotional moment, but I think it's been an emotional moment less for any sense of grief. We're talking about a 93-year-old man, than for a sense that this is a mark in history. I was thinking back to the fact that in the 1930s, there was a huge march in Washington of the surviving members of the Grand Army of the Republic, the people who fought the Civil War on the Union side, and people turned out because they knew that this was the last that we would see. We're saying goodbye today to a man who cast his first vote for Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1932 as a 21-year-old man. There is almost nobody left around who can say that. And so it's not only marking the death of a president and a figure who was indeed much loved by millions of people, but to a guy who literally comes to us from a time that is now clearly receded into history. And that alone makes it a pretty remarkable moment.
The Vice President using the strongest language of any of the speakers we heard from this evening when he basically gave President Reagan credit for ending the Cold War. He said the Cold War is ended by the perseverance of one man. He was more than an historic figure. He was a providential man.
Well, first I was going to say in response to Jeff's point, I think what Reagan, his passing marks perhaps is the end of the 20th century, that we've now moved into the 21st century in a more defined way. But this business that Reagan won the Cold War, I guess this is not a moment to debate these things, but you know, historians will see that, I think, as terribly reductionist. After all, you have to go back to Harry Truman, containment, George Kennan. Kennan predicted that the Soviet Union would eventually collapse of its own accord. This is not to say Reagan didn't have an impact.
He clearly contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War. There's no doubt about that. As we see these guests beginning to leave the rotunda, the diplomatic corps, members of the cabinet, the Supreme Court, members of the House and the Senate. Our Judy Woodruff is up there on Capitol Hill right now. Judy, I think it's fair to say, especially those of us who have covered Washington for so long, this is a rare moment that we all witness.
Well, I felt that there was a real moment of dignity. This was a moment, there was a quiet elegance to this ceremony, very much like the Reagan presidency. It had the mark of Nancy Reagan all over it. It was simple, it was dignified, and I think the remarks that, you know, it is so hard to come up with something that's worth listening to at a moment like this, and yet each one of the speakers, the House chaplain Daniel Coughlin quoting T.S. Eliot, neither does the actor suffer nor the patient act, but the wheels turn. And then you had Senator Ted Stevens saying he reminded us heroes are among us. You had House Speaker Dennis Hastert saying we grant him no greater title than he was an American. And finally, the Vice President Dick Cheney saying he was a calm and a good man, a graceful and a gallant man. These were simple words, a simple ceremony, but it carried all the power that this president deserved.
Thank you, Judy. Right now we're going to check in with Frank Sesno, who covered the Reagan White House and after the president left office spent a great deal of time with the Reagan family once the president was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. Frank, as we all tried to read a lot into Mrs. Reagan's expressions, it was quite clear that it was very difficult for her as the casket was being carried up the Capitol stairs. We at one point saw her lurch forward to touch the casket, and the scene we just saw in the rotunda, where she took her hand and ran it across the casket several times and then looked back as though she couldn't take it anymore. What did you read into what you saw?
Oh, just remarkable dignity and strength and an incredible connection to this man, Paula. She stayed by his side throughout the illness. She barely traveled. She barely left him. She tried as hard as she could to keep his routine normal as long as she could. And some people close to the family said they felt that in his own way, the president was not ready to leave the earth because he always sensed his wife there. That's what she was going through. It was quite clear today, a very difficult experience, but one, too, that I'm told anyway that at least in the abstract she was ready for, that she understood that this was a moment that had to come, and as her chief of staff and the president's chief of staff said a couple of days ago, that this death brought a certain relief as well. But nonetheless, as you mentioned, when she stood at that casket and ran her hand along it and didn't quite want to say goodbye, I think you could just feel her emotion.
And Frank, that flag, which our viewers are now seeing, the flag that covers this casket, this is an important note, and it underscores the precision, the detail that has gone into this funeral service. This is the same flag that flew over the United States Capitol on January 20th, 1981, when President Reagan was inaugurated the 40th President of the United States. Our senior White House correspondent, John King, is with the current President, the 43rd President of the United States, in Sea Island, Georgia, where they're participating in the G8 summit. John, I understand you're getting new information about some of the dignitaries who will pay their respects to the former president.
Well, Wolf, of course, everyday Americans by the tens of thousands lining up outside the Capitol to pay their respects, but we also do know that some of the men whose political careers were defined by Ronald Reagan or were defining figures in his political career will also stop by to pay their respects, including this president's father, George Herbert Walker Bush, who, of course, for 8 years was Ronald Reagan's vice president, then went on to serve 4 years as president. George H.W. Bush, we are told, will go to the Capitol Rotunda tomorrow sometime during the day. Both administration and congressional sources telling that, and our congressional producer Ted Barrett also learning on Capitol Hill that Mikhail Gorbachev, the former Soviet premier, who of course was engaged in such dramatic negotiations with Mr. Reagan on arms control issues, who Mr. Reagan defiantly challenged to tear down the Berlin Wall, he also, we are told, will stop by during the day tomorrow to pay his respects. Perhaps a fitting irony, Mikhail Gorbachev, once the Soviet premier, will be one of the representatives of the Russian Federation at the funeral on Friday. The Soviet Union is no more, of course. Wolf.
Any indication when the current president will drop by the rotunda to pay his respects once he returns to Washington from the G8 summit?
It will be, Wolf, in the evening tomorrow night, in the 7 o'clock hour, we believe. When Mr. Bush gets back to Washington, he will go directly from Andrews Air Force Base with the First Lady to the Capitol Rotunda. And after paying his respects at the Capitol Rotunda, he also will spend some private time with Nancy Reagan at the Blair House. A quick footnote, if I can add in, every politician in that rotunda's career was shaped by Ronald Reagan, whether they served in the 80s or not, because he so shaped the debate about taxes and spending and defense spending. The vice president is a unique figure in some ways. In 1976, he was Gerald Ford's chief of staff. The Ford staff, of course, thought it was treason that a Republican would challenge an incumbent president. Dick Cheney is one of the few Republicans or Democrats who can say they were on a campaign team that defeated Ronald Reagan. Yet he holds no grudges, and I think that is part of Mr. Reagan's legacy. Even those who fought with him, even those who thought at times he might have been unfair to them, don't hold grudges. As a member of the House leadership in the 1980s when Republicans were in the minority, Dick Cheney, one of the critical figures in pushing the Reagan agenda through Congress.
John King reporting for us. Jeff Greenfield, when you think about it, Mikhail Gorbachev coming to Washington to pay respects to Ronald Reagan, and he will join the first President Bush tomorrow and go up to the rotunda. A very dramatic moment that will be.
And Mikhail Gorbachev, John King didn't mention him, owes his political success, historians now believe, to Ronald Reagan. The Soviet Union, confronted by Ronald Reagan's massive defense increases and a much more aggressive foreign policy, began looking for a different kind of leader than Leonid Brezhnev. They picked a couple who died very young, Andropov and Chernenko. They found a young, vigorous Mikhail Gorbachev who was not cut from the traditional Kremlin mold. And Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, equally tough anti-communist, looked at Gorbachev